All right. Welcome back to the Liz Wheeler Show. I'm glad you're here. I'm your host, Liz Wheeler, and boy, do we have a show for you today. We have Mike Benz joining us on the show in just a couple of minutes to tell us some things about George Soros that I did not know before I spoke with Mike Benz. You're not going to want to miss that part of the show. We're going to start the show today, though, talking about the No Kings protest because it was lame and it was weird and it was a bunch of what appeared to be loser boomers that turned out to protest Trump as king, although they couldn't actually describe what they were there protesting. I'm going to show you a video of that in just a moment. We're also going to unmask who exactly was behind the No Kings protest, because that's kind of what we do on this show now. We unmask the people who are staging these very non-organic, very non-grassroots events. This was not just a group of people who decided to turn out to protest President Trump. This was a staged event, highly funded. However, it was not funded by the usual suspects. And what I mean by that is we've spent a lot of time on this show the past 2-3 months talking about Roy Singham and the protests that he funds, like the anti-ICE riots in LA and the Students for Justice in Palestine stuff and the trans violence that you see. That's all tied to Roy Singham. This one, though, No Kings, was not. I mean, Roy Singham was tangentially involved. A lot of the groups that get funding through his groups were also at the protest, but he was not the primary funding source of the No Kings protest. So we're going to show you exactly who was and who those people, it's a creepy couple, who they're connected to. Today's episode is brought to you by All Family Pharmacy. Let's be honest, my friends, most big chain pharmacies, you know the ones I'm talking about, do not care about your medical freedom. They just want you to get in line, take the shot, and move on. I mean, I get text messages from one such pharmacy almost on a weekly basis reminding me to get my COVID booster and my flu vaccine. Yeah, no thanks. All I want when I need a medication is to be able to get it. That's it. It's that simple. That is why I am proud to partner with All Family Pharmacy, because that's how they work. All Family Pharmacy does things differently than the big med pharmacies. They believe your health decisions should stay between you and your doctor, not dictated by some government agency or, God forbid, an insurance company. Check this out. This is how they work. You pull up their website, allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz. You can pull it up while I'm describing it. Search for your medication. They have over 200 options, so you can find the one that works for you. Then you place your order. A doctor reviews your order after you place it, writes you a prescription, and it is shipped straight to your door. That's it. That's all there is to it. The gatekeeping that has overtaken our healthcare system is outrageous. No, it shouldn't be Dr. Fauci or Albert Bourla or the American Medical Association or your insurance company who decides what medication works for you and whether or not you should be allowed to access it. You should decide. That's what medical freedom means. Allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz is the place to go. All Family Pharmacy exists because they respect your medical freedom. So visit them. Allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz. If you use my code Liz10, you will get 10% off. All Family Pharmacy makes it simple, fast, and reliable to get the medication that your family needs now or in the future. Even if you don't need something now, check out their website. Be prepared. Allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz, promo code Liz10. Okay, I don't know if you guys noticed, but the attendees at these so-called No Kings protests over the weekend seemed to me to be a bunch of boomers, a bunch of old people who didn't, I don't know if there was some kind of like coordinated effort to empty the nursing homes into the streets and to pretend that they were the majority in our country. I don't know. But a couple of enterprising young journalists from Daily Wire ventured into one of these No Kings protests, and they asked various attendees how exactly Trump is a king, which is supposed to be the premise of these protests. This is the answers they received. Take a look.
We're out here at the No Kings protest, and we're asking all the important questions.
Such as, if Trump was elected, how exactly is he a king?
Because he is trying to take control of everything, like his checks and balances are not working, so he is just trying to completely disregard the Constitution. So.
Can you explain how Trump's a king?
I don't know. I feel like a lot of amendments have been kind of overcome, like in a way that they're not supposed to be.
Yeah, which amendment specifically?
The first one.
Trying to take away our
freedom of protesting. That's a great question. I don't particularly think he's a king. It's how people are viewing him as. I think MAGA is kind of like a cult, and they see him as Jesus, and that is pushing the narrative that he's a king.
Actively switching the levers of power in order to subvert elections.
And what does that mean?
Things such as trouble coming up with words. Things such as not allowing the congresswoman to be sworn in, even though she was elected before the government shutdown, and using the shutdown as an excuse.
Because he's abusing his powers as though he were a king, and he is not, according to our... Can I take a picture of you? Well, huge, okay, yeah.
I would say that it's because even though he was elected, I agree, due process, he got what he got elected fairly, sure, but he's doing things that make him a king. Like he's taking away, civil rights, he's taking away people's equality and ability to do what they want to do. That's what I mean. That's to me as a king. You're not going to the table, you're not doing what the people want, you're doing what you want, and that makes you a king.
What civil rights is he taking away specifically?
I mean, I know he's trying to take away women's right to vote. That's the first one, and that's a big problem right there. And then our civil rights to just be who we are, to be a basic human.
He's a king.
To be a basic human. Oh, it's funny. Allie Beth Stuckey tweeted and said, tyrannical kings don't let you protest, criticize, campaign, or carry guns. Just FYI. Sal on X said, no kings, they shouted as they begged their government to take total control of their healthcare, retirement, finances, and their children's education. Jimmy on X says, the biggest lesson from no kings is make sure you have kids, because they'll give you grandkids who have football and soccer games that will keep you from wasting your 70s protesting a non-existent monarchy. Yeah, that's about the size of it. If President Trump is a king, he's just the worst king ever, because he gives you right to free speech and the right to protest, the right to mock him, the right to campaign against him, to oppose his policies, the right to vote, the right to lie, the right to free press, the right to carry guns. If he is a king, he's the worst king ever. But of course, and I know that this was never about Trump himself, except for the fact that Trump stands up for objective truth. Trump stands against the radical leftist effort to control our lives. This is very evident that the people at these protests are actually just puppets. They're just pawns. They don't actually even know why they're there. Evidence, of course, by their own words, but really, philosophically, they don't even know why they're at these protests. These protests are not grassroots. They're not organic. They are staged and they are funded. And I'm going to tell you exactly who is behind these protests. So these protests, the No Kings protests, are organized by a group called Indivisible. This group is a leftist activist group, and it was founded by a couple. Actually, if you look up the group Indivisible, it's often described as being founded by two former congressional staffers. And what is neglected, information that's neglected, is that these people are married. This woman and this man, they're a couple. They're married. Their names are Leah Greenberg and Ezra Levin. And yes, they did formerly work as congressional staffers. They also worked at the State Department. They're former State Department employees who specialize in color revolutions, which is a critical piece of this, because there's a video of them discussing choosing the colors for the next color revolution, ostensibly the color revolution that they're trying to stage domestically. Take a look at this video.
Kathy asked a question that is a hot topic of debate internally, Leah. We need a national symbol of unity to stand against authoritarianism or for pro-democracy. I'm interested in using purple bandanas. It's not about being red or blue. It's about standing in solidarity with each other for our democracy. How can we as a group come up with something we can stand behind? So we have had this conversation internally and with a lot of the No Kings Coalition and other folks. And we're circling around an idea that, Leah, we're not allowed to fully announce anything yet.
Well, I mean, so we're actually, I would just say, we agree this is a gap. And one of the things we're tracking and trying to figure out is like, what's getting organic pickup that we can start to pull out and capitalize on, right? And so thinking about things that we're seeing pop on the internet, things that we're seeing start to like take off in places like Reddit. The color yellow and black have come up a lot, which is obviously very like, kind of people taking pieces of the No Kings logo and running with it as a color scheme. we agree this is like a need. And what we really want to do is try to figure out like what's already starting to organically take off that we can collectively come in together on. But we hear you, and we think this is something that we're very much thinking about right now.
We had a whole hour-long meeting with folks. Was it yesterday, Leah? Just on this specifically. So it's one of the challenges, and it's something that we discussed, is when you try to seed something like this, when you try to grow something like this, you start with an idea, and we can all you can debate it should be purple, it should be yellow, it should be green, whatever it is. And one challenge is settling on what that idea is that you want to push, and then you've got this period in between when you've settled on the idea and when you actually make that a cultural phenomenon. And in the in-between period, what you need is a lot of people who say, screw it, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to be one of the first movers out there who's just, I'm all in yellow, or I've got my yellow bandana, or it's, whatever it is. And we're going to need a lot of people who do that. So this group, once we have something, we are going to be asking all of y'all to help be the first movers on this, to make the thing a thing. Hopefully we'll be ready to come back here soon and try to push on something like that.
Okay, so just to be clear, the video, that was Ezra Levin and Leah Greenberg, the couple that founded the group Indivisible. Indivisible is the group that staged, that coordinated, that planned, that mobilized the No Kings protest. You heard them describing a color revolution. They are former State Department employees who are experts in color revolution, and they were specifically describing picking colors, as you do for a color revolution, for not just the next protest, but for No King's Day specifically. They said some people are talking about yellow and black. Well, that's what you saw out in the streets. You saw a bunch of old people with toddler tiaras on wearing yellow and black because that's what they decided was the color of their color revolution. Again, the point of all of this, it might be obvious at this point, this wasn't a grassroots organic event. This was a highly staged, funded, coordinated event. And by the way, there were U.S. aid employees that were reportedly handing out posters. In New York City, the No Kings organization partnered with the local Communist Party. This was a highly coordinated, lots of left-wing groups were involved. And you can look up more information about those groups. I want to stay with Indivisible for a second because I think the crux of what the group Indivisible is and who they get their funding from and why the person that funds them gives money for this cause is extremely important. So Indivisible gets, I would say, the majority of their money. Their last tax return showed a little bit more than half of their money coming directly from George Soros and his Open Societies Foundation. Now, we've spent the last probably 2 months on this show talking about Roy Singham. And what's interesting about protests that are funded by Roy Singham versus protests that are funded by George Soros is oftentimes the protests that are funded by Roy Singham aren't really protests. They're riots, they're violence, they're agitation. And it's intended to be so, whether it's the violent anti-ICE riots, whether it's the Students for Justice in Palestine, the pro-Hamas stuff, whether it's the radical pro-trans militant groups. Roy Singham is an open communist, and what he funds in our country, the groups, the riots, are violent. George Soros, on the other hand, you're probably more familiar with his name. We all have been familiar with his name for a couple of decades now, probably since before I was born. He's been one of the biggest Democrat donors for decades, yet his events, or the events that he funds, the groups that mobilize and plan those events, they're not quite as violent initially as Roy Singham funded protests, but they are equally as destructive. Here's what I mean. So on this show, or actually behind the scenes on the show, we've been having discussions for a while about identifying George Soros' ideology. Because when you think of George Soros, you think globalist, which is accurate. You think open borders, which is accurate. But that actually doesn't describe what he believes. He's been somewhat reticent to admit publicly what his beliefs are. And so some people will be like, oh, he's a communist, he's a Marxist, he's a socialist. Well, not exactly. He's not. In a sense, it would be easier if he were, because it would be easier to define and identify the various parts of his ideology in his work, but he's not. So what is he? Because globalism and open borders, that's not really an end. That's a means to an end. So what is he trying to achieve and why? So what we did is we did a little bit of a deep dive into George Soros's background. We're going to have Mike Benz on the show here in just a moment. I'm just teeing this all up for Mike. And he's going to describe to us what motivates George Soros. But I want to bring to your attention something that I read. George Soros, back in 2003, wrote this is actually a transcript of a talk he gave called America's Global Rule. And it was essentially a criticism, a critique of the George Bush administration on every level, but especially about the Iraq war. And what's funny is you and I actually agree with George Soros now about Bush's mishandling of the Iraq war, just for very different reasons. Soros didn't like how Bush was handling the Iraq war for very different reasons than you and I disagree with how Bush handled the Iraq war. But in this piece that George Soros, it was a speech he gave that he turned into an essay. It's posted on his website called America's Global Role. There are a couple of quotes. He's describing his worldview. He's describing what it means to support open societies. And this is what he writes. And I quote, "In an open society, people can decide for themselves what they mean by freedom and democracy." He goes on to say, but the Bush administration claims that we have discovered the ultimate truth. People can decide for themselves what they mean about freedom and democracy. So what he's proposing is that an open society, it actually doesn't have to do with open borders. That's not what he's describing. He's describing a society where there is no objective truth that's recognized by the government or by the people, by civil society. He's describing a relativistic society. He goes on to quote his inspiration for the phrase open society. He says, "Because open society is an abstract idea, I shall proceed from the abstract and general to the concrete and particular. The concept of open society," George Soros writes, "was developed by philosopher Karl R. Popper, whose book, Open Society and Its Enemies, argued that totalitarian ideologies, such as communism and fascism, posed a threat to an open society because they claimed to have found the final solution. The ultimate truth," Soros writes, "is beyond human reach. Those who say they are in possession of it are making a false claim, and they can enforce it only by coercion and repression." So Popper derived the principles of freedom and democracy, the same principles that President Bush championed in his February speech on Iraq, from the recognition that we may be wrong. End quote. So Soros, again, is saying that there is no such thing as truth, that anybody who claims that they are in possession of the truth are lying, and the only way to make that truth accepted is by coercion and repression. He goes on to talk about how you transform a society that recognizes truth into a so-called open society. He says, quote, "A world order based on the sovereignty of states, moreover, cannot take care of our common human interests. The main source of poverty and misery in the world today is bad government, repressive, corrupt regimes, and failed states. And yet, it is difficult to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries because the principle of sovereignty stands in the way." End quote. So he, of course, presents this as if he is a humanitarian. He presents this in an altruistic way, as if he wants to solve poverty and, help countries who have been repressed by a corrupt government. But the takeaway from that paragraph shouldn't actually be his misconstruing his own interests in meddling in foreign countries, which are probably to profit himself, which we'll get to in a moment. No, the takeaway from that sentence is that he doesn't believe in sovereignty. He doesn't want nations to be sovereign, because sovereignty, what does sovereignty do? Sovereignty protects the institutions, the norms, and the traditions on which a culture, a civil society is based. So if you wanted to destroy the institutions, the norms, and the traditions, which are based on objective truth and not relativism, you would maybe open a border to destroy the sovereignty of that state. And suddenly, George Soros' ideology becomes a little bit clearer to me than it was, say, a week ago. And I was like, what does he believe? Why does he want globalism? Why does he want open borders? Like, obviously he's a leftist. He gives the radical leftist causes. It's not that he's somewhere, it's not that his ideology is nebulous, but what drives it? Well, he doesn't believe in objective truth. So he encourages the redefinition of terms, your truth, my truth. He wants to destroy sovereignty to make that happen, because if you destroy sovereignty, it destroys culture. Culture is how we collectively as people protect truth. In addition, of course, to his stupid globalism stuff. He doesn't want America to make our own decisions. And we're going to talk to Mike Benz about that aspect of it, the economic aspect of it. But the root of all this, what is the root of all this? Well, the root of all this, George Soros actually did admit at one point. In 1998, he did an interview with 60 Minutes. And you can find this here and there. It's not widely disseminated anymore. But in 1998, George Soros was asked whether he was religious himself or whether he believes in God. And this was George Soros's answer. Take a listen.
Are you religious?
No.
you believe in God?
No. Soros told us he believes God was created by man, not the other way around, which may be why he thinks he can smooth out the world's imperfections.
Okay. Are you religious? He was asked. No, he replied. Do you believe in God? He was asked. No, he replied. He believes that God was created by man and not the other way around. So not to sound preachy here, not to sound religious, but George Soros' hatred of the United States and our norms and our traditions and our sovereignty is based on hatred of the foundational principles on which our country was built, that of God and Christianity. And isn't this always the case? It's always a hatred of God that motivates them. That's why they killed Charlie. That's why they're blinded by hatred of Trump, even though they can't describe it when they're asked. Because no, he's not terribly religious. Trump's not terribly religious, but he defends truth. Not truth he defines, truth that is objective. That's why they want to destroy all definitions of objective reality, because that is written by God. That's natural law. That's why they're seething with hatred at the United States, because we're built as a Christian nation to allow us to glorify God. That's why they want to dehumanize us, because we are made in the image of God. That's why they want to kill. That's why they want to kill more. Look at the attendees who turned out to this No Kings protest. Attendees who are dressed as Charlie Kirk's assassin, who mind shooting someone in the neck. Threats against the life of Stephen Miller and his family. We have video of protesters fantasizing about guillotining Trump. This is not normal. This is not political division. This is evil. These people have chosen darkness because you can try to separate politics and religion, and we've tried that a lot in our country, but it will fail because you can't. Ultimately, it's always about God. It's always about God. But it's also about George Soros' strategy, how he controls this country, and what he's using groups like Indivisible to do to benefit himself, but also to destroy the country. And that's why we're going to speak with Mike Benz. We're going to bring him on here in just about 60 seconds. First, I want to talk to you about Crowd Health. This time of year, insurance companies are hoping that you'll sleepwalk into another cycle of overpriced premiums, network headaches, endless fine print. Makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. It's open enrollment season where they're betting that you won't question anything, but you should, because there is finally a better way. My husband and I, it's just about our 1-year anniversary when we called up our health insurance provider and quit. We said, we're not doing this anymore. We're not paying these high premiums, just have unreachable deductibles and have our claims denied. There must be a better way. We joined Crowd Health. Crowd Health is not insurance. I like to call it assurance. It's a community of people like you and me who've had enough of the old system and are taking healthcare back into our own hands. For under $100 a month, you get access to prescription discounts, lab testing tools, a network of quality doctors, and a team that negotiates medical bills on your behalf. And if something major happens, because it does now and then in our lives, you pay the first $500 and then the crowd steps in to help you with the rest. It's what healthcare used to feel like before it got hijacked by bureaucracy and bad policy. Crowd Health members have already saved over $40 million simply by refusing to overpay. You can too. This open enrollment, take your power back. Join Crowd Health to get started for $99 for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com. Use my promo code Liz for that deal. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Liz. Crowd Health is not insurance. I like to call it assurance. Opt out. Take your power back. This is how we win. Joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Liz. All right, with me now is the founder of the Foundation for Freedom Online. You know him and I know him. One of our fan favorite guests here, Mike Benz. Mike, good to see you.
Great to see you, Liz.
All right, Mike, we have a couple of things to unpack today, but start for me with this group Indivisible and their founders, Leah Greenberg and Ezra Levin. I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, that you would define them and probably their work is at Indivisible as at least being inspired, if not directly a part of the Blob. Would that be an accurate characterization?
Yes, absolutely. So the Blob refers to the foreign policy establishment, the foreign-facing globalist side of the American government and really the American empire. It was coined not by me as a Trump supporter, but actually by Barack Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, who used that term to describe the entrenched foreign policy establishment in Washington that the White House perceived as being more powerful than the White House itself, something that you could not vote out. It was bipartisan. It consisted of a inside the government structure, concentrated within the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, USAID, the Department of War, but that has layers above and below it connected to oligarch billionaires, multinational corporations, private investment funds, hedge funds, private equity funds, and then down beneath that, layers and layers of NGOs and civil society organizations who receive grants and contracts, grants in particular from USAID, the State Department, and as well as foundation grants from the foundations associated with the multinational corporations and billionaires. I refer to that as the donor drafter class, that top side. So in talking about George Soros, he's the quintessential donor drafter in the sense that he is a major donor into political campaigns. He was the number one donor for the Democrat Party and has been since the early 2000s. In fact, there's an early 2000s SNL sketch making fun of how basically every Democrat politician is a marionette of George Soros because of how much funding he does. But the thing that I think is important to understand about George Soros, and actually before that, I'll just connect the tie, which is that Indivisible, according to the most recent tax filings, I believe had about $12 million in basically working capital. And now these are from 2023, so this doesn't even count the past 2 years because the 2024 tax extension deadline just happened a couple days ago. And so this is a common thing that you can't get the tax records for the Form 990s for 501c3s until about 2 years after, basically. But it was, so they had about $12 million then. And I think about $7.6 million came from George Soros's proprietary Open Society Foundation. So over half of their entire funding comes from George Soros. And they are, we'll talk about their operations in a second, but just to understand the sort of Soros business model. So Soros, I don't think of him as a particularly ideological person at all, actually. I don't think of him as a communist. I don't think of him as a socialist. He is, in many ways, the hybrid of capitalism and socialism, depending on when it benefits his own hedge fund properties. George Soros came of age in the United States after, immigrating here, is a New York City hedge fund guy speculating primarily on foreign currencies for countries that were under the Iron Curtain in Central and Eastern Europe. And then in 1979 started the Open Society Institute, the Open Society Foundations, after his older brother, Paul Soros, was already in the game with the State Department and the Blob. So when I first started doing some of the deep dive research on this, I went into, because this whole thing is connected to the State Department and USAID, and this idea, when I call it the donor drafter class, the donor part is that they donate into political campaigns and they also co-donate with State Department and USAID initiatives. So you will frequently see, for example, a USAID grant to civil society organizations in Zambia. And then you'll see a part of that initiative will be the Open Society Foundation, a handful of other foundations like the Ford Foundation or Carnegie's, and private businesses. And you're like, what are they doing in Zambia? Well, 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, what you're going to see is there's some energy deal. There's some Halliburton wants the oil rights. Shell has a clean energy initiative. Some mining company that Soros is invested in wants to get access to the precious metals. The opposition party is running on ethanol mandates for fuels, while George Soros, the management fund, has invested in these ethanol companies in the country. This is, so the drafter part of it is like a bike race. In a bike race, you never want to be out in front where you are doing the work and cutting the wind for everyone behind you. In a hedge fund or a multinational corporation scenario, you don't want to be paying your own private army to topple a government. You don't want to be paying out of your own pocket all the civil society organizations involved in the color revolution. You want USAID to do that. You want the Department of War to go in and retake eastern Ukraine so that your Burisma or Halliburton or Shell assets can take advantage of the crude or shale. And so this is really this relationship where the donor class drafts off of the policies and the trade policies, the sanctions policies, the brokered licenses and regulatory structure, the labor laws, the government mandates that the hedge fund is invested in. And this is, I think, really kind of the key to understanding Soros, which is the Open Society Foundation functions as street muscle for what the George Soros Management Fund is invested in. And it has been this way for 4 decades now. You can trace pretty much every major operation that the Open Society Institute has been involved in, whether you're talking about Poland and Hungary and the Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria during the Cold War, whether you're talking about Russia and Ukraine post-Cold War, whether you're talking about Bangladesh in 2024 or Brazil in 2022 or the United States here, you can directly map Soros's investments with the philanthropic arm that shows up in the streets with signs and sometimes Molotov cocktails in the adjacent protests in order to advance what is effectively a hyper-capitalist money grab. But this is another thing, is that this socialism capitalism debate that often happens between the right and left, I think it sort of misses the point here, because sometimes businesses do better under a socialist model, even when the economy doesn't. Like a great example is in Brazil. George Soros was thick as thieves with the Joe Biden State Department and USAID to regime change Bolsonaro and install Lula, who quickly attached the entire economy to China, divested of American interests, and on day one installed these clean energy mandates, while George Soros had already taken massive long positions in the very ethanol clean fuel replacements that got mandated by the Lula government. So that's good for Soros's businesses, even as it's terrible for the Brazilian economy. So and many businesses work this way. In public health, George Soros has taken massive long positions in AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson and big pharma companies. These companies often rely on government mandates, like we saw with the vaccines, or they rely on the declaration of a WHO emergency for SARS or Zika in order to get those governments to buy massive quantities of the very pharma companies that Soros is invested in. And so this is how I think the best way to understand the kind of driving modus operandi of the Open Society Foundation behind Indivisible is. And obviously, with USAID being cut, about $30 billion a year have already been cut in grants. The rest are kind of being impounded by the White House, by Russ Vought. You also have massive cutbacks to State Department grants, many of these Pentagon civil affairs programs. So they want nothing more than to regime change this government in order to bilk more money out of U.S. taxpayers in order to maximize the profits of investments around the George Soros Management Fund. And that's also why you see a very confused messaging and, frankly, a flop during this No Kings protest. It was very confused. Nobody really could articulate what exactly was wrong with the country. Crime is down. The stock market is at all-time highs despite tariffs and the like. The only thing that's hurting right now are effectively these faux markets that were artificially created by Biden statecraft and blob government mandates.
Yeah, that's it. I think you're right. I think the phrase that I would use to describe it is it's egregious crony capitalism. And I almost hate to even define it like that, because usually capitalism has a pretty positive connotation with us here on this show, because I am, pro free markets, of course. But I think it's crony capitalism. It's corrupt capitalism, because he also is controlling the politicians who control the markets then to favor him. It's cheating. I also think it's interesting. So we've been having this conversation behind the scenes, me and my producer Spencer, for about a week about George Soros's ideology, because it's pretty easy when you look at Roy Singham, for example. We've talked a lot about Roy Singham on the show over the course of the past 2 months. And his ideology is extremely easy to define. All you have to do is go read something that he's written, go look at the people he associates with. He's very openly Marxist-Leninist, right? He's very openly communist, and it informs all of his decisions. But George Soros, even though he has been the boogeyman of the right for a long time, and validly so, it is a little bit more difficult to define his ideology because he's not exactly a communist. He's not exactly a Marxist. He's not exactly a socialist. Like, what is he? We mostly define him by his desire for open borders. But even that, I was saying earlier today, actually, I was saying, yes, but that's not the ends. He doesn't just want open borders because it sounds like open society. They're actually like not the same thing. He wants that because it's the means to an end. So what is the end that he wants? And listen, I stayed up half the night last night reading as many of George Soros's writings to try to find the answer to that tiny little question. And I think, Mike, the answer to that is that he's godless. And I don't mean to sound religious or preachy here. I'm just observing that he said in the interview we played earlier in the show in 1998 that he doesn't believe in God. Well, if you don't believe in God, then you don't believe in objective truth. And the very definition that he gives on his own website of what it means to be in an open society is redefinition of words and moral relativism. You know, you can define what freedom means to you, and you can define what democracy means to you. And he wants to destroy cultures by opening borders to destroy the norms and traditions and institutions that actually uphold objective truth.
Right. Well, I think there's the direct quote. If you just type in George Soros God quote, this is a passage from his book, The Alchemy of Finance, published in 1987. He wrote, "I have always harbored an exaggerated view of my self-importance," he wrote. "To put it bluntly, I fancied myself as some kind of God."
Okay.
I fancied myself as some sort of God. Well, it's very interesting. You know, in a lot of Soros's autobiographical writings, he talks about how he started off kind of wanting to be a philosopher, a la Keynes, or kind of economic philosopher. He has these kind of proprietary theories of how the market works, like reflexivity and the like. But he realized that he could not really achieve the kind of philosophical reforms unless he had godlike money, and so he focused on money rather than on philosophy. It's kind of reminds me of Ellsworth Toohey in The Fountainhead. You know how he goes into like religion and ethics, even though he's told that there's no career there, and he's like, "Oh, there is. Trust me, I'll make a lot more money than you as a major in religion than you will in economics, because I'll hijack the economics, understanding how religion works." And so, but I do think fundamentally, Soros is a kind of just primal id of the hedge fund world. If you think about how, you know, stories like Enron and how Enron grew to be something like the 7th largest company in the world, and it was this giant energy giant, and it had a lot of proprietary properties in the oil and gas space, but ultimately what got it in trouble was it started playing games with its trading arm. They would, because they were the suppliers to for example, California power plants, when they set up a trading arm, they realized that they could simply cut short their supply to the power plants and then cause a rolling brownout and then take massive short positions or long positions in the very market they were creating. This is the George Soros model. If you effectively control personnel at the White House or the State Department or the Central Intelligence Agency or the War Department, and you are speculating on the currency of the Philippines, well, you can, if you know that you can make a couple phone calls to destabilize the Philippines or to twist the arm of a regulator to grant a license to a portfolio company. I always refer to this as insider trading on national security secrets. This is this deep relationship between the State Department and George Soros at a bipartisan level, because George Soros started off doing this under the Republican Ronald Reagan. This is why if you go to Google Image and you type in George Soros, John McCain, you'll find just pictures of them looking like they're making out. They're about to make out. It's like a love scene out of a romance novel. And this was the Republican nominee for president in 2008. Yeah. And it's the...
Go ahead. People are doing this right now, by the way. You know, they're literally typing out.
Just Google image, George Soros, John McCain. And you will see this relationship is thick as thieves. And it plays out in country after country. It's one of the reasons it's so difficult to get Soros-adjacent arms like the National Endowment for Democracy shut down despite a Republican majority in the Senate, a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, and a Republican president. It's because the internationalist Republicans team up with George Soros when it comes to international affairs. And it's been this, and again, so George Soros was doing this for 8 years from 1980 to 1988, helping Ronald Reagan win the Cold War by toppling left-wing communist governments. He was not a, I don't think it's the right way to understand him is as a communist socialist, even though it manifests as such on a selective basis, because many of the industries that he invests in profit under effectively communist socialist mandates, a la climate industry investments, a la public health and pharmaceutical investments, and even in shipping and manufacturing. And this is one of the reasons that Soros is basically co-investor with so many of these George Soros, Al Gore, Tom Steyer. They all move together. And so you have this kind of hedge fund overclass. I think Tom Steyer gave something like $250 million to Democrats over the past few years, and he's a co-investor in all of these. So you see this, and what that does is that puts pressure on the American government, because this is who funds the people who are in the government, and it's also who pays them afterwards. And so what this does is it's not just insider trading on national security secrets. It's kind of the Nancy Pelosi stock portfolio thing where she can just invest in the very things that she's writing regulatory bills around. So she knows what to invest in way before the market does. Same thing with George Soros, but it hijacks American foreign policy. It hijacks American leadership in the world because we do coups or we put pressure on governments not because it's best for American interests or best for American national security, but because it's best for the private, hedge fund portfolio of the donor class who then drafts off of those policies. It was not good for American interests to lose Brazil to China. It's not good for American interests, what we're doing, frankly, right now in Ukraine or Central Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. But it is good for those investors, and those investors provide the money for the political apparatus. So when that political apparatus takes power, they continue this revolving door relationship with the Soros investor class.
Yeah, so it's good for George Soros's wallet, is what you mean. That's why his net worth, by the way, currently stands at $7.2 billion. You're not just good at picking stocks.
And that was after he committed $18 billion to the Open Society Foundation, which his son runs.
Exactly right.
So it's not exactly love lost, It's not exactly
such an unfathomable amount of money to me. Wait, go back to what you said before. So 1980 to 1988, and we showed those pictures, by the way. It does actually look like John McCain and George Soros are about to embrace. We showed this on the screen, but when you say George Soros was helping Ronald Reagan during that time,
yes,
topple leftist governments, like socialist, Marxist governments in Europe. This is interesting to me because another word for that would be a color revolution, right? They were staging color revolutions abroad. George Soros is a master. He is an expert in staging color revolutions. I would argue that that's what they're doing here in the United States right now. That's what circles all the way back to the No Kings protests this weekend. They literally discussed on video, we also played that earlier in the show, picking colors for their color revolution. These are the organizers, this creepy couple that started the group Indivisible. They were the ones discussing what colors they should choose because it's such an important part of what they're trying to stage. So now tie this back to us. If this group, Indivisible, run by this couple, they get at least half of their money from George Soros. And we don't know, by the way, if he gave more money specifically for this protest. That's just data from 2 years ago. It could have changed drastically from between then and now. And
do you think?
I suspect that it did. I suspect that it did. We'll know in 2 years. We'll circle back and we'll talk about this topic again. Talk to me about Leah Greenberg and Ezra Levin. Talk to me about Indivisible. Talk to me about their State Department ties. Talk to me about, they're also experts in color revolutions.
Yes. And what you see is, and they're the head of the snake. There are hundreds of these NGOs who I think the total number was something like $290 million in various, NGO grants that they've all gotten collectively. And so the structure is you have this kind of George Soros interstitial umbrella entity. And in this case, it's Indivisible. But in every country, you're going to see something like Indivisible. And then you're going to have this kind of tree root structure of all these different categories of civil society organizations like union groups, the teachers unions, the nurses unions, the transportation unions. They will help with the street muscle. You'll have the student groups associated with the universities and these kind of anti-professor organizer types. You're going to have all the different human rights organizations and whose job abroad is documenting human rights abuses so that prosecutors associated with George Soros prosecution funds. George Soros works very closely with the USAID and State Department rule of law programs, which is effectively their little connective tissue to the courts and prosecutors to political opponents in France or the Czech Republic or Romania or Brazil, what they did to Donald Trump here, or Kosovo with Jack Smith and the like. And so you have all these different groups, and they need to be organized. They need to be, they are kind of operating on their own in their own lane, but then they are all getting common funding from these massive foundations, the Open Society foundations and the like. And so they need to be wrangled and aligned like a magnet. And that's what the Indivisible has been doing, frankly, for several years. They were a big part of the 2020 protests. If you remember the Molly Ball Time magazine article about it looking like a right-wing paranoid fever dream. But it turned out it was true. Behind the scenes, there was this shadow network working discreetly to fortify the election by, rigging it all sorts of ways. The media, the censorship operation, the shutdown DC protests and the like. And Indivisible was a very big part of that in 2020 as well. This has been this domestic color revolution cell that is basically the connective tissue to all these different discrete cells. And so it gets it centralizes the otherwise decentralized cells receiving foundation grants. And I should point out, actually, there's this Antifa blog called Crime Think. And I posted about this on my X account. But when Trump announced that he would be declaring Antifa a terrorist organization, they penned this article saying that they weren't sure yet how it would be enforced, whether it would be bottom up, cell by cell through all the different Antifa cells,
I
Portland,
read this actually when you posted it.
Right. Or whether or not it would be top down, going after, quote, massive liberal foundations.
But I thought it was a decentralized network. Mike,
right.
I thought Antifa was just the wind.
Right. But this is how they do this, and frankly, this is also how you try to structure things to get out of RICO. I remember when Gavin McGinnis stepped down from the Proud Boys when the New York state prosecutors were going after the Proud Boys on totally BS grounds. Basically, they were jumped by Antifa people coming out of an event. They defended themselves, but because they won the fight, the New York state prosecutors went after Proud Boys like a terrorist group, basically. And I think one of the definitions for the charge on RICO and organized crime was there had to be a leadership structure. And I think that was actually technically when Gavin McGinnis stepped down to try to help. If I'm recalling this correctly, this basically a way of trying to show the court that this was not, some top-down leadership-led thing. And this is the exact cover that Antifa tries to run. Of course, all of their websites have .org associated with them. It's unbelievable. I posted like 30 different Antifa websites, like Portland Antifa, the Rose City Antifa. It's .org. Well, what does the org stand for in .org? Anyone?
Centralized network, obviously.
It's an organization.
What do you know?
It's an organization. That's what .org means. And they're all organized. They are all organizations.
Of course they are. So what this weekend, though? So what was the goal then? If this was obviously State Department, color revolution experts, Leah Greenberg, Ezra Levin, part of the blob, funded by George Soros, because this is how he works as a donor drafter. Both for economic purposes and ideological purposes, because he wants to destroy objective truth. He wants to destroy sovereignty as a way to destroy culture, to destroy institutions that protect norms and traditions, etc. What specifically was under target this weekend with this protest?
Well, there are many goals with getting people in the streets angry and revolting. And there's the kind of periodic show of force, the show that the mobs will be back bigger and better than ever with pitchforks next time if you continue these policies. The end goal of a color revolution is essentially a surrounding of the country's parliament building and the president leaving in a helicopter as the United States recognizes a new government that has the support of the people. And so it's kind of a substitute for a Democratic vote, because the sheer size of the mobs shows that the will of the people is not being respected. Because look at the million people in the street. Obviously, the State Department's enemy didn't really win this election, because look at all of the people on the streets. They clearly won the election. There are so many of them. This is why they try to gin up the numbers. And
so
Liz,
is it normalizing a coup? Is that what they're doing?
Of course, that's a huge part of it. When you lose the election and you are trying to claim that the president is illegitimate or a tyrant dictator who does not represent the Democratic majority this is the language you saw. Mehdi Hassan in his speech said, "We are the majority." You're the majority.
Of what?
You lost the popular vote. The first time in 20 years, you lost the popular vote. You lost the Electoral College. You lost the presidency. You lost the House of Representatives. You lost the Senate. It was a clean sweep. But they have to say, we are the majority, because look how many of us, there's 100,000 of us here. I don't see any Trump supporters here. Everybody's on our side. And then you have USAID media and State Department media and Soros-funded media amplify that until the international community goes, yeah, you know what? I don't see Trump supporters on these streets here in Boston. But this is why they had to fake the footage. Liz, remember this. This is so crazy, and I don't think they should ever be able to live this down. The most viral footage from the No Kings protest was fake. What CNN and MSNBC and Occupy Democrats and almost every major DNC, Harry Sisson and the like influencer put out about the show of force. Look, there are millions of us here. Was fake footage. It was from a women's march in like 2017. They faked the footage about how many people there were to create a fake patina that this was the Democratic consensus. And so therefore Trump is illegitimate. He's an authoritarian who's trampling on what the people want. It is a substitute. The show of force in the streets is a substitute for losing an election at the polls. And when you can call an opponent an authoritarian tyrant who's using extraordinary measures to crack down on the people's will, it justifies the people taking extra legal actions to depose that dictator. That is why Gene Sharp is their guru. That is why the State Department, USAID, and the CIA hands out copies of Gene Sharp's From Dictatorship to Democracy at every single protest and activist event. And which itself is downstream of a $50 million Department of War grant from the 1950s to help the U.S. military and intelligence folks be able to overthrow governments when they can't accomplish a top-down military coup. They perfected this bottom-up street paramilitary coup. And this is how George Soros started his career with the Blob in the 1980s, helping this happen inside of Poland with the Solidarity Movement, helping this happen inside of Hungary, helping this happen inside of Romania. And this is why these Soros foundations, who were funded by the U.S. government and working hand in hand with USAID and NED, ended up having such big influence there in those countries when the Cold War ended, and how George Soros got to be such a big part of American NATO policy. He wrote The Future of NATO, around how essentially the United States should use NATO as a civil affairs weapon in the 1990s, at a time when people thought NATO should be disbanded because the Cold War is over, and how George Soros is tied up in these USAID lobbying groups like the Global Leadership Coalition, which was created to save USAID when people thought USAID should be disbanded because the Cold War is over. And of course, it was President then Bill Clinton in the 1990s. And the Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, George Soros relationship has been thick as thieves for 30 years.
And this, by the way, is why it's called the Blob, because its gooey tentacles reach everywhere. It's also why it's critical to understand that George Soros says in an open society, every person can define democracy the way that they want, because to them, democracy is not actually the will of the people, like winning the Electoral College and winning the popular vote and the presidency and the House and the Senate. It is people, you and I, being forced to adhere to the radical leftist ideology, even when that radical leftist ideology loses at the ballot box.
George Soros was backing the Nazi Azov battalion brigades in Ukraine against a center-left government of Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. So, there's no right-left ideology here. The thing is George Soros had made massive investments into naftogaz and privatizing the energy market through which all the gas transits in Europe ran through in Ukraine. So it's not right. He's the primal id of crony capitalism, as you said, and of the hedge fund overclass that marionettes so many of our puppets, which is why it takes strong-willed men and women like we have, I think, frankly, right now in many respects inside our movement to resist that, even when it's not, it foregoes an easy cash grab.
On our side too. It's the uniparty. It's the uniparty. Listen, Mike, I know you have to go. I'm going to let you go, but I got to tell our viewers, I have a video that I have to show you. So you guys don't go anywhere, but thank you, Mike, for being on the show. I really appreciate it. As always, thank you for breaking it down.
Thank you, Liz.
Okay, guys. So President Trump was asked about the No Kings protest this weekend, and his answer was what I would say is classic President Trump. Take a look at this.
Protest over the weekend, the No Kings protest.
I think it's a joke. I looked at the people. They're not representative of this country. And I looked at all the brand new signs paid for, I guess it was paid for by Soros and other radical left lunatics. It looks like it was. We're checking it out. The demonstrations were very small, very ineffective, and the people were whacked out. When you look at those people, those are not representative of the people of our country.
Mr. President, besides San Francisco...
By the way, I'm not a king. I'm not a king. I work my ass off to make our country great. That's all it is. I'm not a king at all.
Over the weekend, the No Kings protest.
I mean, is he wrong? Whacked out attendees, coordinated, printed posters and signs funded by George Soros, and he's not a king. He works hard every day. I think that's right. We will rate that as correct. And the protests as highly coordinated, funded events, not organic, not grassroots whatsoever. All right, guys, make sure you're subscribed to the show. Go to youtube.com/Liz Wheeler, x.com/Liz_Wheeler. And if you could, pull up the Spotify app on your phone, search The Liz Wheeler Show, subscribe if you would, and give us a 5-star review. I really appreciate everybody who's been subscribing and been giving us 5-star reviews. It helps other people find the show. So it's your good deed for the day. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.